Hola chicos, paso a saludarles rápido. En un momento vamos a estar, ¿verdad?, con Carmelita eh, Cuores y Jan, que tienen de invitado a David Agren, eh, para que estemos abordando temas sobre Nicaragua, ¿verdad?, sobre la petición de libertad por Monseñor Rolando Álvarez y eh, entre otras cosas, también se va a hablar, ¿verdad?, que está a punto se acerca el cumpleaños de Monseñor Rolando Álvarez y pues es su segundo cumpleaños en la cárcel. Independientemente que ahorita tengamos muchas alegrías con lo del Miss Universo, eh, no vamos a olvidar, entre otras cosas, ¿verdad?, que Nicaragua vive una dictadura. Nicaragua tiene exilio masivo, Nicaragua tiene problemas económicos, Nicaragua hay un salario mínimo bajo, hay desempleo, hay miseria, hay hambre, hay un valor de la canasta básica alto, hay represión, hay asedio, hay una iglesia secuestrada, está en manos de la dictadura. Cuando quieran, donde quieran y como quieran, hacen lo que quieran con la iglesia, en contra de la iglesia. Hay una aparente normalidad en la iglesia, pero no es normal que se prohíban eventos, no es normal que hayan 90 sacerdotes secuestrados, no es normal que haya un sacerdote, un obispo secuestrado, no es normal que se hayan exiliado miles de laicos católicos, no es normal que la gente salga y que incluso se cuestione orar en la calle o llevar algún símbolo que represente el catolicismo o no es normal, nada de eso. Entonces, hay una aparente normalidad, hay que estar claro que no es normal. Entonces, estamos con la alegría del Miss Universo, pero hay muchas cosas que las podemos olvidar si vos querés. Incluso a veces se me olvido por muchos días a mi pariente, a mis amigos, a mi familia. Incluso eso, ¿no? O algunas pasiones que tenía yo en cuanto a Nicaragua, pero no debemos olvidar. Debemos tenerlo en presente diario que Monseñor Rolando Álvarez está secuestrado. Yo creo que ya empezó, ¿no? Bueno, todavía no hay nadie hablando. Entonces les voy a pedir que compartan esta transmisión, ¿verdad? Para que eh,
that Little Queen tonight is offering our simulcast on his Facebook and YouTube channels, and we're grateful for that. Also, we have Pino Lero here tonight, as usual.
los dejo con el evento.
He's worked in journalism for the past 20 years, started out as an intern in Canada with the Globe and Mail, but it wasn't long before he left Canada and moved to sunny Mexico. And he took his journalism skills and experience with him. He started out in Guadalajara and then moved to Mexico City, and that's where he's been plying his trade ever since. And if I were to list all of the publications that have carried articles written by David Agren, we might never get to these questions. Just suffice to say that he's covered everything from religion to crime to politics and all sorts of stuff in between for media outlets in North America and the UK. I mentioned earlier that he covered the terrible fires in the Indio Maíz Nature Preserve in Nicaragua. And that was published in The Guardian in the UK. But tonight we want to focus on his experience in the last 5 years covering the persecution concerning the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. And as you can imagine, since David lives in Mexico City, he's also bilingual. So tonight he'll be translating for our Spanish-speaking listeners. And as always, if you have a question or comment, please feel free to speak in the language you prefer. And we always appreciate everybody's patience in a bilingual space, so thanks once again. If you want to speak, just tap on the microphone symbol. And tonight we're trying to be respectful of our time and limit our conversation to no more than 90 minutes. Y como David es bilingüe, traducirá para nuestros oyentes de habla español. Si tiene alguna pregunta o comentario, no dude en hablar en el idioma que prefiera. Siempre agradecemos la paciencia de todos en un espacio bilingüe. Muchas gracias. Si desea intervenir, pulse el símbolo del micrófono y siempre intentamos ser respetuosos con el tiempo y limitamos las conversaciones y preguntas a 1 hora y media. And so much for my iffy Spanish. We'll go ahead and Pino Lara, would you lead us off tonight? You've got the first question.
Okay. So this is the first question. So David, you have been a journalist for about 20 years, but you began in Canada and then you moved to Mexico. So tell us about your background and what attracted you from the great white north to sunny Mexico and eventually covering news from Latin America.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Where do I start? I first traveled to Mexico in 2002 as a student. It was after 9/11, and I admit I was actually quite disenchanted with journalism, or at least journalism school. And there was an opportunity to study abroad in Mexico, so I took advantage of that. I didn't speak any Spanish, but I knew somebody who had previously gone on a student exchange to Mexico and quite liked it. And I went to a state university in Colima, which is south of Guadalajara near the coast, and it was quite an experience. It was just a completely different experience. It was still at a time when you had to learn some Spanish in order to get along, to get by, and to make friends. And so I started learning Spanish there. I went back on another student exchange. This had some scholarship money through the NAFTA treaty. Then I went to Guadalajara, and upon finishing my degree, the journalism job market wasn't the best in Western Canada. And although the job market was great, the journalism job market wasn't. And I started applying in Latin America, and I was hired by a newspaper called the Guadalajara Colony Reporter, which published in English as a English language weekly. And there was a lot of retired Canadians and Americans that lived in the Lake Chapala area. And so there was a newspaper there. It was funded basically by real estate ads. And that's where I started reporting, and moved to Mexico City 2 years later to work for a newspaper called The News, covering politics and national affairs. And then that went on. Well, it was sold basically to the people belonging to the then presidential candidate Enrique Peña Nieto, and he basically turned it into a bit of a propaganda arm for his presidential campaign. And so I started freelancing, and one of the first clients I ever had was Catholic News Service, and that I pretty much have always stuck with. I stuck with them right until the end, until the bishops decided to discontinue its national desk, and at that point, I was fortunate to catch on with OSV. And so that's pretty much where how I got into Mexico, and how I got into reporting on Catholic media, and in Catholic matters. And it always seems like there's a great interest in Latin America for Catholic, or from editors for Catholic stories from Latin America. And so that's pretty much where I got started. And I should just say, with Central America, the Central America story, it just feels like ever since 2014, prior to that, there was really not a strong interest for whatever reason. It felt like after the the strife of the 90s and before that, it felt like editors for some reason just stopped being interested in it. But with 2014, with child migration crisis, suddenly a lot of migration stories started coming onto our plate. So that's where I started traveling more to Central America, not so much Nicaragua, because it just wasn't a big migrant producing country, or at least migrants going north. And so with Nicaragua, it all started in 2018 with the Guardian just asking me to write about the fires in Indio Maíz. The Guardian tends to like environmental stories, and what struck me about the story, that I didn't think anything really of it at the time, other than it was a fire with some questionable with a questionable response, in large part because the Nicaraguan government rejected aid from Costa Rica to come in. But I remember talking to a journalist who was there covering it, and largely they were being held back by the government. They were not being, if I remember right, their accreditations were seized or something to that effect. And so the fires ended up, I think, being extinguished largely because of nature, because there were some rains. And that, oddly, afterward, I had to respond to a reader complaint from the Guardian. Some apologist for the regime just was writing about how I was wrong and how I was mischaracterizing the relationship between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and I was misquoting some environmentalist, and it just, it was just largely spin. And I guess that was a sign of what was to come. And so pretty much ever since the protests broke out and the bishops were involved in involved in mediation, pretty much from that point, it feels like had to pay a lot of attention to Nicaragua.
Wow. It just amazes me how this all came together for you. Would you just summarize that for our Spanish-speaking listeners?
Yo llegué a México, yo fui a México la primera vez en 2002 como estudiante. Fui como estudiante intercambio a la Universidad de Colima, en el occidente de México. No sabía nada, no hablaba nada de español, no conocía mucho de México, pero tenía ganas de aprender segundo idioma, y por eso aproveché la oportunidad. Volví a México en 2004 a Guadalajara, y en 2005 volví de nuevo a Guadalajara para trabajar con un periódico semanal, The Reporter, The Guadalajara Colony Reporter. Se publica en inglés. Desde ahí fui a la Ciudad de México, trabajar en un medio que se llama The News. Es un medio que tiene de una familia irlandés-mexicana, que siempre tenía cobertura muy destacada en inglés. Y desde allá, cuando terminó este medio, o cuando se vendió, me volví un periodista freelancer, y con Catholic News Service siempre ha sido, bueno, por mucho tiempo fue mi cliente. No sé, no voy a decir que cliente principal, pero siempre era un constante en mi carrera. Y en 2018 The Guardian me pidió una nota sobre los incendios en la reserva Indio Maíz, y terminó siendo una nota polémica, por sorpresa, y obviamente por la falta de respuesta del gobierno. El gobierno rechazó ayuda de Costa Rica, y también negó permiso a muchos o frenó mucha cobertura, frenó mucho acceso a los periodistas, y por eso esto fue, ¿cómo digo? Mi cobertura empezó con de Nicaragua, comencé con comenzó con esta noticia y ha sido muy, ¿qué puedo decir? Hay mucho interés y siempre editores me están pidiendo notas sobre Nicaragua y principalmente la persecución de la Iglesia Católica y en medios católicos y hasta el Financial Times.
Well, you sure have had plenty of opportunities in the last 5 years to make your reports, to do this coverage. My question would be, since you were, as far as I can tell, the first journalist to cover
Probably
the story from the Catholic perspective, I wonder how it is that Barb Frey said, "Hey, we need you to cover this story. Will you do this for us?" How did you get started covering the Nicaragua story for Catholic News Service?
well, yeah, I don't know if I was the first, but I probably was. I think I was pretty early on it. Where to start? I just remember calling Catholic radio and Catholic and various dioceses and just trying to make contacts just to see who would talk. And people were suspicious. There were people that were pretty terse and like not wanting to talk, not trusting who you were, and I get that. So it started somewhat. It's always been a bit of a difficult story, and it's just in the sense that you have to find sources and you have to find people willing to chat, and part of one thing that I think foreign editors don't appreciate is that people talking to a reporter take a risk. They don't entirely know who, they don't usually know, they don't in the beginning know who they're talking with exactly. And being in Mexico, you don't really get the face-to-face, and calling down there, you don't get the face-to-face introduction, which really breaks down, helps to really break down suspicions and build trust. So so I just started that way, and tried to just. It felt like a little different story in the sense that, it felt like a bit of a standard story to cover in the sense that there were people talking. The bishops' conference was certainly issuing statements. I believe Bishop Baez was quite, was speaking out. And then also, it was just such a natural Catholic story, just because there was the UCA, the Central Universidad Centroamericana, that was involved, and there were parishes that were obviously being places of refuge, that were opening their doors as places of refuge for protesters. So it felt like, in a lot of ways, like an important but standard, in some ways standard story, that a story of unrest. And then the dialogue started, and those were quite astonishing. Just the obviously the student comments, and basically the expectation that something would, that there was a chance that there was a chance of a political solution. And so but it just sort of felt like everything went south when, if I remember correctly, the talks were suspended, and then there were basically, I'm sure if I'm getting the sequence right, but I remember that there was the nuncio, and I think there was Cardinal Brenes, and also I think Bishop Baez. I think it was in Messiah, where they were jostled by a crowd, and there was hostilities. And then there was the a friend of mine, Joshua Partlow, was hiding in a church that was being, or seeking refuge in a church that was. He's a journalist with the Washington Post. He was seeking refuge in a church that was being besieged. So it was just that's when it sort of started getting kind of what's the right word? Difficult, and then. Journalists stopped being able to go to Nicaragua, and it just sort of felt like it was a downhill story. And at the same time, people were leaving the country, and those are the people that tended to talk. And the people in the country just started to get more and more shy, and so it sort of it always felt like a really important and eventful story. But I think one of the things that happened because of the Catholic angle and because the church persecution has just been so constant, I think a lot of media sort of I don't say they abandoned the story, but it sort of was front burner, became back burner. But with the Catholic media, it's always been front burner, just because of the constant persecution. So so it's a lot of the source building is just reach out to people and hope they respond. But it's candidly, anyone in Nicaragua has just gone silent, and that's just fear, and people largely convinced, perhaps correctly, that all of their devices are bugged or being monitored in some way.
That's so scary, and it's crazy to think of that there's a country in the Western Hemisphere that operates this way.
North Korea. I remember talking with someone from the International Crisis Group who said, it's becoming North Korea in Central America. It's totalitarian.
Yeah.
I think that's the way to describe it.
Yeah, that's it. Why don't you go ahead and share something for our Spanish-speaking listeners? We have quite a large group over on YouTube and Facebook tonight.
Oh, okay. Well, largely, okay, ¿qué digo? Yo, si me recuerdo correctamente, como nota de los medios católicos, siempre esa nota ha sido muy importante. Siempre había mucho interés en la cobertura obviamente por la represión contra la Iglesia Católica. Y me recuerdo en los principios siempre tenía la sensación que sí, esta es una nota importante, va a tener un impacto, pero no fue tan difícil cubrirlo en los principios. Obviamente, tuve que esforzarme a hacer llamadas, buscar contactos, fuentes. Obviamente mucha gente tenía dudas sobre mi medio, pero muchos en aquel tiempo me recuerdo la gente, sí, hubo gente había gente que me hablaba, pero y con los diálogos entre la sociedad y el gobierno, con los obispos como si me recuerdo, como mediador. Ellos, me recuerdo, este tiene mucho, los comentarios que salieron tenían mucho eco. Pero después, fue obvio que esta no iba a volverse más triste, más difícil. Y me recuerdo cuando por ejemplo, el cardenal, el nuncio y un obispo fueron agredidos en Masaya. Me recuerdo un amigo periodista extranjero tenía que buscar refugio en la parroquia allá. Y por eso con esta nota, en términos de fuente, de las fuentes de información, se volvió cada vez más difícil porque mucha gente no tenía ganas de platicar, mucha gente pensaba que su teléfono, los teléfonos eran intervenidos, y por eso, es cada vez más, que pues, es un reto, y yo creo que es un poco como Corea del Norte en Centroamérica.
Claro que sí. One question that comes to mind is whether or not you at any moment experienced a personal threat from someone in the Sandinista regime or a Sandinista fanatic who threatened you in response to one of your articles?
No, and I think it should be clear. I mean, the people that are really the brave ones are the Nicaraguan journalists who have, had to, abandon the country. Many of them are in places such as Costa Rica, and they've been able to maintain some sources and get some really good information, useful and accurate information out of there. So I just complete respect for them. I'm somewhat lucky in that, being based in Mexico, I think I sometimes wonder if they're paying a lot of attention to the foreign press. One odd thing I've noticed in my writing, in my reporting on Nicaragua, I wrote a story for the Lancet back in.
I just saw it about the criminalization of the medical community.
Yeah, and that one was, I guess, everything you see happening at the UCA. That sort of, that story pretty much was a forerunner to that. People being denied their credentials, people not. Basically, people being denied their credentials, and the government. But I remember with that story, I saw comment from the government, and obviously Rosario Murillo, the vice president, is the government spokesperson. And I reached out. I sent an email, and she responded. Well, actually, she forwarded it to the then health minister, who responded. I maybe didn't like looking at obviously the response to the questions. I mean, there actually was a response to the question. That's sort of, I mean, that's always appreciated, but that was sort of a surprise that for whatever reason, they felt compelled to respond. A lot of foreign journalists don't get responses. And ever since then, I will send queries to her, and basically what you get back is just some weird GIF or whatever you call it, sort of basically just something with colorful fonts that basically says, we're holding our heads up high as we march forward, and just sort of an inane statement that doesn't respond to your question, but it's a response. So, but no, I think for the people experiencing the threats and doing the real brave work are Nicaraguan journalists.
Absolutely. I think a couple of things that you've just shared there would be very interesting to our Nicaraguan listeners. Would you share a bit of that in Spanish?
Sure. Yo creo que mira, los héroes en estos son los periodistas nicaragüenses. Ellos viven bajo riesgo, ellos toman riesgos para encontrar la verdad, y ellos, obviamente, muchos de ellos tuvieron que huir del país, pero siguen siguen en su trabajo, tienen sus fuentes, los fuentes están bien colocados en el gobierno, en el país, y la verdad, la información que publiquen es muy confiable. Por eso ellos están, ellos son los héroes en esto. Y yo diría, sobre el gobierno, obviamente la vicepresidenta es la vocera del gobierno. Y he escrito sobre la comunidad médica en Nicaragua, sobre la persecución de ellos. Y me recuerdo, yo estaba buscando comentarios y yo envié un correo, le envié un correo a la vicepresidenta, y creo que la Secretaría de Salud, ella me dio respuesta. Y además, ella a veces siempre la envió, muchas veces la envió preguntas por la nota. Y ella da respuesta con unos comentarios comentarios locos que no tienen nada que ver con la nota, dicen, pero bueno, esto es, yo diría que la importancia, yo creo que el periodismo sobre Nicaragua hoy día es un ejemplo de cómo debe ser el periodismo, la verdad.
¿Verdad? A nuestros oyentes de habla español, por favor.
Compartir el enlace.
Y disculpe, compartir el enlace para este espacio con sus seguidores. And thanks again to everyone, to our English-speaking listeners. Don't forget to share this space. Just click on the share button at the bottom of your screen and share this with your followers, if you would, please. Koikel, hello, Koi. Do you
Yes,
have
hi. Good afternoon, David. Good afternoon.
Hi there.
Hi, how are you? Good afternoon, everyone. David, what surprised you the most about events in Nicaragua in the 2018? Actually, I have a few questions. There's three.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to make them all together.
Sure.
Did you ever feel unsafe covering the story? And for
No.
you, what has been the most memorable while you were covering the news in Nicaragua? Thank you, David.
Oh. So, boy, surprise. I just think the surprise, well, I think I've gotten to the point, unfortunately, where I think the most surprising was when the regime expelled the missionaries of charity. The Mother Teresa, if I'm getting the name right, Mother Teresa's religious order. I thought that was sort of the one where truly, like, what's happening here? That one. That was probably one that I certainly didn't expect. And certainly, I've never had to, never been unsafe, but it should be said, journalists don't go to Nicaragua. I think there was an NPR reporter who went recently, and that was quite a remarkable piece of journalism that he did from there. But I think the surprising, I guess what was surprising, it once everything started going downhill, and the repression started ramping up, and Bishop Baez had to leave the country. It just sort of, I feel like, in a way, nothing. It just sort of felt like this was sort of I guess I just should say it just sort of, I always sort of had the view that it's just this process of just unfortunately getting worse. It's just a process of getting worse. And there was really there was nothing to stop it getting worse, unfortunately. I think that was the thing. And so I guess the more I think about this, that certainly the surprise, I guess the surprise is just the depths of depravity that the regime has gone to. I think that's the surprising part.
Would you share some of that with our
Well,
Spanish-speaking
I just
listeners?
say lo más sorprendente es que la profundidad de la mal de este régimen, no siempre es cada vez peor y es cada vez más cruel. Y eso creo que es lo sorprendente, pero yo creo que un hecho, lo más sorprendente fue cuando las misioneras de la caridad se expulsaron. Esto fue, ¿qué puedo decir? Con este hecho, todo fue posible, yo creo.
Thank you, David.
Yes, thank you. You've talked already tonight about how your sources began to dry up from the beginning, where people were talking with you and it's okay, and then you say, explain to us the fact that there's this fear, there's this concern that Big Brother is listening. And so people are not as forthcoming. Your sources have dried up. How are you able to cover the story at this particular point in time, since we are seeing the evolution of a North Korean type regime in Nicaragua? How are you covering the story? What sources are you able to use now?
Well, I mean, look, a lot of the people are sources are people who have that's sort of a tricky topic. You obviously go with people that are familiar with the situation. Sometimes there are people outside the country who it's people outside the country who are familiar with what's occurring inside the country through it's not always, sometimes firsthand, but sometimes not. What tended to, it was sort of interesting because there were very few, it sort of felt like things were starting to go silent, sort of gradually things started to gradually go silent. It felt like, there was, I remember the Archdiocese of Managua had a group that would issue statements and confirm information about what was going on, and then that line went suddenly cold. And I remember there were some priests just throughout the country that were quite just by their nature outspoken, and even they started wanting to be anonymous, and then they just stopped responding. That happened, and then pretty much when Bishop Alvarez was arrested, hauled out of his office, that's sort of when the line really went cold. And it ever since then, it's been pretty much you talk to people around that sort of have you pay attention to what the government is saying or what's going out through their state sponsored media, and then you pay attention to Nicaraguan media. I mean, you also talk to people who are in the church and not necessarily in Nicaragua, but they will talk. And so that's kind of the way it's gone now. And it's what's the right word? It's sort of one where you just sort of pay attention to as many sources of information as you can, and verify what you can. And I think a lot of it, but a lot. I admit it's a tough nut to crack. This getting information out of Nicaragua and confirming it.
I hear that loud and clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't you tell our Nicaraguan listeners about your experience? And who knows, maybe somebody might want to contact you on the side.
Okay. Well, bueno, siempre si alguien me quiere contactar, yo le puedo proporcionar mi WhatsApp o Signal. Mira, siempre había, ¿qué puedo decir? Me recuerdo antes, por ejemplo, la arquidiócesis de Managua, hubo un grupo allá que publicaban boletines sobre lo que, y también me confirmaron datos de todo lo que estaba pasando. Y también siempre había sacerdotes que con ganas de platicar, siempre por su naturaleza. Esta gente siempre siempre tenían pronunciamientos y poco a poco ellos me dejaron de platicar. Y además siempre había Monseñor Alvarez, pero cuando se lo metieron en el cárcel, desde este momento ha sido silencio total. Y entonces yo hablo mucho con gente fuera de Nicaragua que tengo conocimiento de qué está pasando o que me pueden proporcionar información o confirmar información, pero es bien difícil, la verdad.
One of our listeners, who is a native Nicaraguan, is asking a question, and I'm going to put it out for you right now.
Okay.
Del contexto sociopolítico,
Uh-huh.
¿qué fue lo más difícil de entender y de las cosas que suceden? ¿Qué fue lo más difícil de creer? Gracias.
De creer. Los comentarios de la vicepresidenta y esta persona y sus comentarios desmedidos, el tono es siempre, ellos están siempre hablando de golpes, de gente golpista, hablando de terrorismo, hablando de tantas cosas. Esto es lo más difícil creer. Lo más difícil entender es todavía no entiendo bien. ¿Este régimen tiene seguidores todavía? ¿O solo es gente que lo hace porque son acarreados, como dicen en México, o porque por coacción, o lo hacen porque son empleados del Estado? Eso es el contexto que no entiendo. Un contexto que también no entiendo, y quizás esta es una observación un poco que no es bienvenido, pero no entiendo bien todavía 100% la historia de la relación entre la Iglesia Católica y Daniel Ortega. Esto sería muy útil esclarecer todo esto. porque obviamente hubo momentos cuando la relación no era tan mal. So, esto es una pregunta que tengo. So I just say sort of some of the context to understand the comments from the vice president and are just unmeasured and completely unhinged, and that's sort of one of the it's a sort of so some of the context that I don't really understand is who is supporting the regime. Is anyone supporting the regime? Is it just people who are herded into rallies, or people that are threatened, or state employees who have to show support to keep their jobs? Those sorts of things. And I guess one question I just always had is I'd like to know. I admit this maybe isn't popular to ask, but what was the history of the history of the church and Ortega. At times they seemed they got along better, and at other times it was quite tense. So I think that's something that I don't know. Maybe I don't know if this is the right moment to ask it, but it might be interesting to sort of have a proper account of that.
Jotter, ¿puedes aclarecer un poquito más tu pregunta? Hola, Jotter. Oh, I have to add him, sorry. Anyway, we'll see if we can get Jotter Motors on to explain some of that, because he has inside experience. Jan, would you go ahead with your question?
Okay.
Sure, thank you. David, you mentioned earlier that the Nicaraguans are the brave ones. And are there some individuals in the Nicaraguan church who have left a lasting impression on you, or perhaps someone in Nicaragua who inspires you in your work?
Well, I find obviously I find Monsieur Alvarez quite a remarkable person. That he just will not leave the country. He would rather be imprisoned than exiled, and it's become very obvious that for the regime this is really uncomfortable for them. They keep wanting to expel him, and he keeps refusing to leave the country. I find that very remarkable. I can think of a priest. I don't know if I dare mention the name. I remember writing about some of the hurricane cover. There was a big storm two storms that came through. I think it was the end of 2020 or 2021, and some of the priests up in the north east of the country, up on the Caribbean coast, really with very little, we're able to provide so much assistance. I think of someone like I believe it was Rodolfo French was the priest up there, and the way he did it, his work, especially working in the mosquito communities.
Our little volunteer group was just talking about Padre Rodolfo earlier this evening.
Yeah, I always found him quite inspiring and quite a really remarkable individual. The work he did, and the candor he had, and his he really left a lasting impression, definitely. In covering Nicaragua. Yo te iba a decir que obviamente yo creo que el Monseñor Alvarez, obviamente su ejemplo es es una inspiración, es muy, él prefiere quedarse en Nicaragua, aunque es preso. Prefiere esto más que vivir libre en otro país. Otra persona que siempre que admiro mucho es el padre Rodolfo French. Obviamente trabaja en las comunidades del Caribe y siempre denunciaba la injusticia allá y trabajaba muy fuerte para las comunidades muy marginales allá. Obviamente no sé qué pasó con él, pero ojalá que esté salvo y sano.
Sí, claro que sí. One question that I have is kind of looking ahead
Mm-hmm.
with North Korea south of our border, as
Yep.
it were. We just found out that the processions in this time of year once again are being shut down, prevented, and then the regime trying to control the narrative is wanting to have its own processions, if you will. The Christ the King procession, which has been going on for decades now, that was shut down. There were no processions to celebrate Christ the King today, and processions for the Griteria are also going to be prevented. Now, whether or not families will be able to visit one another and celebrate have their Purísima altars in their homes, on their property. Bishop Baez in his homily today, he encouraged everyone, not in his homily, but in his remarks at the end of Mass, encouraged everyone, go ahead, decorate for the Feast of the Griteria, go ahead and make beautiful altars, visit your family, visit your friends. But the question is, with such unhinged, as you say, rabid repression going on in the country, to what extent do you think that the fear is going to rule over Griteria this year and, any religious festival thereafter, Christmas, whatever?
Yeah. Well, it's hard. That's a hard one for me to say. Yeah, I would anticipate that obviously we have priests being effectively spied upon, basically, and there are these recurring purges, or I don't know what the word is, but basically terror campaigns where they basically are abducted and taken off and thrown in prison. I think
Purge is a good word. Purge is a very good word.
That's sort of I think that's an indication. These acts sow terror, and people comply. And one of the things you recognize in Mexico with, for example, I'll use a Mexican example where I'm close to it. When you have a lot of attacks on priests, and there are many in Mexico, when it happens in some of these areas with a lot of drug cartel violence, they sort of recognize the priest is a local authority figure who is, sort of I don't want to. I use this word very advisedly. Sort of a local power, and someone that has is looked to and respected by the local population. Sometimes these narcos in Mexico, they consider themselves proper Catholics in spite of all they do, but when there's a priest killed, it's effectively a message of, you know, we rule. And it you know, if you're taking out, if you have the, or if you're willing to go that far, people understand what's being said. And I think there's some of that, you know, when the priest is taken away from a community with violence, people get the message, and people know that they need to comply with what the government says. And I think one of the things that I think the Associated Press had a really good story on this. It's good to see this when with the Miss Universe reaction to the Miss Universe result. You know, people ran out in the streets with a flag. You know, if you wave a flag in Nicaragua, you're getting thrown in jail. And so people, I think that's what was really so remarkable about that event, was that people lost their fear for the moment. People showed their patriotism, showed their love of country, and it sort of challenged, in a way, challenged the regime without challenging the, you know, they were just celebrating a local who succeeded on the world stage. But in a totalitarian country, obviously, any act like that is seen as subversive. So I guess that's what gives me hope, is that people are still willing to challenge the challenge the rules. But at the same time, like I said, if the government's hauling away priests, I'm not sure people are going to want to go out to the religious processions.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair estimation of everything. You want to share some of that for our Spanish listeners, please?
Yo iba a decir que el ejemplo que yo tengo es en México. En México hay muchos sacerdotes asesinados. Hay más sacerdotes asesinados en México que cualquier otro país del mundo. Y obviamente a veces tiene que ver con el narcotráfico. Mira, esos sacerdotes en sus comunidades son autoridades. Ellos tienen un papel muy importante allá. Y cuando los asesinaron, obviamente este crimen manda un mensaje. Y el mensaje es que el narco manda. Eso, eso es para mostrar su autoridad. Y yo creo que en un país como Nicaragua, si el gobierno, si los policías paramilitares secuestran un sacerdote y si lo meten en el cárcel, es para sembrar el terror. Y la gente sabe que es mala idea salir a participar en las fiestas patronales. Por eso yo creo que es muy desalentadora. El futuro en este aspecto es muy desalentadora. Es muy discouraging. No es alentadora.
Entiendo. David, you know, we always ask our guests to share a concrete idea for a way that we can inform and encourage others, especially the English-speaking, to advocate for the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for our English-speaking listeners or our Spanish-speaking listeners who are outside of the country, how we can increase solidarity for the persecuted church in Nicaragua. What do you think?
Boy, that's a question that's that's a hard one. You know, the only thing I could really think is to just obviously keep highlighting the story. You know, keep. I think that's sort of the importance of, you know, Shanice Palacios. Just that her, you know, win is Miss Universe. That you know, it's sort of interesting that she would be so important, but it is because it just sort of reminds people that there are people in Nicaragua, people who are struggling and resisting and refusing to completely comply with what the regime is demanding of them. So, but the big thing is, you know, support journalists, support journalism, support Nicaraguan media outlets that are reporting on this, share their news, subscribe, highlight them on social media. You know, I think that's really important. But it's a sort of the thing that's sort of interesting is it's sort of it feels like in a way like the regime has just been very impervious to outside pressure. I don't know. I think one of the things that maybe needs to be a little more maybe highlighted is some of what the regime is doing in terms of its weaponizing migration, for example, the way it's you know, stripped a lot of visas, and you know, the country has basically become a jumping off point for migrants going north, and you know, I don't think they're doing that necessarily out of for humanitarian reasons. It's just more let's cause chaos for you know, for the United States. So I think in some ways maybe just highlighting the things that the regime is doing, even the way that it's very cynically using migration sort of as a way to prop up the economy. You know, you can see that the remittances going in there are reaching high levels, and that's sort of buoying the economy. So it's sort of I think I would just pay attention to all the news that's coming out of to Nicaragua, and sort of, you know, I think with more attention, maybe that's where that's where the pressure the pressure will come.
That's helpful. Thanks so much. We have a fellow Canadian in the space tonight, and we want to make time for questions and comments. Michael Lima Quadra is with us. Michael, do you have a question or a comment to share?
Deb, thank you very much for this space, and thank you for all the amazing things you do for the cause of freedom in Nicaragua and for the Catholic Church. I have a question. I'm enjoying this space, very informative. I'm a human rights activist, and I work with human rights activists in the island, so I'm familiar with the situation in Nicaragua and Venezuela. I wanted to ask David about the silence of the media here in Canada. In general, silence in terms of the Nicaraguan story from the beginning, from the 2018 protests, the persecution of the church. I think, David, we need you here in Canada. Why did you leave? We need more journalists covering the resistance movements in Nicaragua, in Cuba, Venezuela. Unfortunately, the media here it's not a topic that is highlighted. We don't see political shows talking about Nicaragua. We see it talking about other contexts worldwide, different authoritarian contexts, but not necessarily Nicaragua. And that would be my question. You were talking about pressure, and that's a part of it.
Yeah,
thank you.
The one that I appreciate this question. I have always found Canadian media to be somewhat to have a crushing disinterest in Latin America. Now, I will say right now that the Globe and Mail has been reasonably good. I think maybe in some ways I need to start pitching them stories about Central America more. Nicaragua, they will take stories from freelancers in Latin America, but it's not a place where they're paying attention to it and assigning stories. I think that's sort of maybe a distinction to make. If they get a good pitch from somebody in Colombia, Argentina, Mexico, they'll run the story. They had a correspondent in Latin America, but I remember she was based in Brazil, and sort of, maybe make it up sort of Central America, from time to time. It's a big region, so obviously that explains some of that. With the Canadian media, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is that it's going downhill, and going downhill in a hurry. It's now subsidized by the federal government, and I believe it's going to get more subsidies, which, that's a fraught issue. So part of it is that they just do not have budgets, much less for national news. So international news, they're going to put it further down the list. Two, for reasons that I don't 100% understand, they don't look at Latin America as a source of news that they should be paying attention to for whatever reason. If they're going to think internationally, they're going to start looking at, the UK, maybe the Middle East, and then maybe, obviously maybe China or somewhere like that. But so it's just not. There's just a distinct lack of curiosity going on there. The communities, the diaspora communities, it's interesting. I feel like in Canada, a lot of the coverage too, and a lot of depends on diaspora communities. And I definitely hear a lot more Spanish when I go back to Canada, but I just don't. I just don't know if politicians, or what's the right word, media outlets sort of. There's a thing in Canada where politicians there's an accusation that the foreign policy in Canada gets a lot of attention. Politicians will sort of see, well, we have a large Indian community, so we're going to start focusing on that, or Chinese community, so we're going to be focusing on that. And it sort of feels like the presence of a diaspora in Canada sort of dictates the foreign policy. And I feels like with media too, if there's a large community from another diaspora community, that's where they start paying attention. So maybe I need to start talking more to go to places like I don't know, I'm thinking newer upstarts, the Hub, the Line, these sort of new media ventures in Canada that are sort of getting going and doing good work, more commentary than reporting. But I think those are the two big reasons. One is just the sorry state of the industry, and then two, it's just they're not paying the foreign editors just don't pay attention. And part of the reason they don't pay attention is just because there's just the diaspora community. I think it's a good size now, but it's just the diaspora community just doesn't. What's the right word? For whatever reason, they just don't think it warrants attention.
I'm thinking about Caliber Mining, which is a Canadian interest.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
The protest down in Panama, has that been covered?
Not extensively. And Canadian mining companies, I've never gotten good responses to stories on that. And that's a story I'm not 100% sure why. I kind of suspect that it's a legal minefield. I think the Canadian government
literally.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. No, it is. And Canadian governments have really spent a lot of political capital, diplomatic capital on this, and sort of to the detriment of the country's image. I mean, that's unfortunate. It's just sort of, the Canadians do have a reputation for being rudos. They go into the deepest and smelliest muck, and they definitely leave some really troubling situations or scenarios that have to be cleaned up.
Thank you, David. I appreciate your response.
Yeah, no, let's talk more offline. Yeah.
Sure, yes, I'd love to connect, and definitely the Latin American interest is not very high in Canada. I studied Latin American history here in grad school, and it's not
Mhm.
like in the US where there is a connection, historical connection to Latin America. Canada did not
Yeah,
start to pay attention to the region until well into the 20th century, into the later
that's
part.
true.
So I definitely agree with your point,
Yeah.
and thanks for
Yeah,
sharing your
no
thoughts.
problem. The one thing I'll say, just as a sort of a frustration with Canadian media, the story I get contacted about constantly is Canadian tourists finding misfortune in Mexico. There are no there's a lot of times I won't even pick up the phone. Like I won't even respond. Like it just um, usually usually it's Canadians travel to Mexico in very very large numbers. And and they encounter misfortune. But the more I would look into these, it was somebody they were drinking excessively, or they were doing drugs, or they were in the wrong part of town, or I don't mean to blame victims, but it was just often Canadian. There's something weird about Canadians going to Latin America. It's a very orderly country, and with social mores for not causing a ruckus, and it feels like Canadians will go to Mexico, and they'll just lose all their inhibitions. And I've seen it with embassy staff, and so it's sort of when it comes to Canadians in Latin America, I tend to be kind of jaded and not very complimentary.
That might be something, Michael, that later on after the space, you and David can connect on in regard to Canadian vacationing in Cuba, because I know that's an issue that's of concern to you. David, before we close up our space tonight, I'd like to give you the opportunity to say whatever you'd like in Spanish to our Nicaraguan listeners, because they're not a small crowd, and
Okay,
they
well,
probably need will appreciate all the encouragement that you may be able to offer them.
pues, mira, yo just quiero expresar mi solidaridad con la lucha por su país. La verdad, como extranjero a veces soy un poco ¿cuál es la palabra en español? Estoy un poco detached, decimos en inglés, y es como no, pero yo he visto una resistencia muy valiente y me duele mucho ver la represión, la falta de libertad. Obviamente como periodista, ver que los medios se cerraron y todos los periodistas independientes tuvieron que huir el país. Voy a seguir cubriendo esta noticia y ojalá que un día podemos decir que sí, recuperamos el país.
Una iglesia, ¿cómo se dice? Una iglesia crucificada resucitará. I don't say it very well, but I think our friends understand what it is. Listen, we're really grateful that you came tonight, that you've given us some concrete suggestions of what we can do to keep highlighting the story, to support the Nicaraguan media outlets and to highlight them on social media, and to keep informing folks about what the regime is up to. What nefarious deeds they're working on their population at any moment. Last week, everyone, we continued our conversation with Roger Martinez, and I'm really grateful to Jan, Koikel, Pinolero, and even Lapeque that we were able to have that communication and conversation with Roger. Next week, Astrid Monte Alegre is going to be with us. And like I said, she's going to talk about the impact of the repression in Nicaragua and its impact on immigration. And as an immigration attorney, she's going to have, I think, some really particular insights that she will be able to share with us. So I want to say thanks again to everyone. Gracias a todos ustedes, a todos nuestros oyentes, Nicas, muchas gracias. Y Jan, thanks. Coy, Pinolero, thanks. Loqueen, muchas gracias. A ti y a todos los seguidores de Loqueen and Facebook y YouTube. Y Jan and Pinolero, would you close us with prayer tonight? Jan, would you begin with the Our Father? And Pinolero, if you're ready, you can close us off with the Padre Nuestro after Jan. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, David. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Padre nuestro que estás en el cielo, santificado sea tu nombre. Venga a nosotros tu reino. Hágase, Señor, tu voluntad así en la tierra como en el cielo. Danos hoy nuestro pan de cada día. Perdona nuestras ofensas, así como también nosotros perdonamos a los que nos ofenden. No nos dejes caer en tentación y líbranos de todo mal. Amén.
Amen. We have a couple of late questions that came in, David. I'm going to send them to you in private, and we'll be able to get your response
Okay.
that way.
Okay,
And
sounds good.
sounds good? That's great.
Yes.
So to everyone, we want to say thanks. We want to ask you to come back next week for Astrid Monte Alegre. And we will follow up on the late questions that we received in private. So thank you, everyone, and God bless. God bless everyone. Have a good evening.